Sisamnes, Royal Court of Susa, 524 BC. His body is still warm. The skin is coming away in strips, wet and red, curling like parchment in a fire. Blood pools at his feet, thick and slow, clinging to the stone floor as if unwilling to be absorbed. The stench is unbearable iron and sweat, but also something sweet, the scent of flesh turning to rot before the soul has fully departed. His eyes are open. They do not blink. They stare at the men working over him, knives flashing in the lamplight. Each movement deliberate, practiced, almost tender in its cruelty. Somewhere beyond the chamber, a dog howls, and the sound trembles through the damp air. The guards say nothing. They stand in their bronze helmets, watching, their shadows bending against the wall like tall, silent witnesses. Every slice of the blade pulls a breath from the room. Every drop of blood writes a silent accusation no one dares to speak aloud. The strips of skin are hung on hooks. They sway gently, dripping, tapping against one another with a sound like whispered words, and still, no one speaks. There is something here no one is allowed to name, an arrangement sealed in the dark, a betrayal deeper than greed. Perhaps it is not just the man they are flaying, but the truth itself. Outside, the city continues its evening prayers. Inside, the work goes on, slow and precise, as if the victim's pain is being measured for some hidden purpose. This is not an execution. This is a message, and the real reason for it has been buried for centuries. The sun over Persepolis was a pale coin in the morning haze, its light diffused through a thin veil of dust that hung in the air. The streets were already alive with the shuffle of sandals, the murmur of merchants, and the distant clang of bronze striking bronze in the military yard. But in the great courtyard, before the Hall of Judgment, there was a silence too heavy for the hour. Men stood in lines, rigid as statues, their eyes fixed on the marble steps where the royal guard awaited the arrival of the king. In the center of the space knelt a boy no more than 14, his dark hair matted with sweat, his wrists bound with braided leather. His breathing was shallow, shoulders trembling not from the morning chill, but from something colder, heavier. Beside him, a tall officer held a thin, ceremonial spear, its tip catching the light. It was not meant for battle. It was meant for pointing at the condemned. From the colonnade, the nobles began to emerge. Their robes rustled like dry leaves, embroidered hems whispering against the stone. They kept their distance from the boy, but their gazes clung to him with the weight of judgment. Somewhere among them, a priest of Ahura Mazda whispered the morning prayer, his voice a thread that barely reached the air. The words were supposed to summon truth into the space, but today they sounded like a summons for blood. The king appeared at last, Darius himself, in robes the color of deep wine, the gold of his torque burning against the gloom. His steps were measured, his face unreadable, but the set of his jaw betrayed that this was no ordinary hearing. The guards shifted. The officer raised the spear and pointed it at the boy. The gesture was not quick, it was deliberate, a slow drawing of the invisible line between life and death. The accusation was simple, the charge devastating a lie spoken in the name of the king, in the empire of the Achaemenids. A lie was not a mere failing, it was an act of cosmic treason. Truth was the spine of the world, and to fracture it was to tilt the balance of creation itself. But the boy did not look at the king. His gaze kept drifting to the flagstones beneath him, as though something there, some crack, some stain might open and swallow him before the sentence was spoken. The air was thick with the scent of oil from the torches, the faint tang of sweat from the pressed crowd. In the distance, a camel groaned, a sound oddly human in its pitch, as though the earth itself were mocking this trial. The priest stepped forward, carrying the rod of witness. He touched it to the boy's forehead, marking him as one who had stood before judgment. The boy flinched at the cold bronze, but said nothing. The verdict came not in a shout, but in the steady, resonant voice of Darius. Hands that carry falsehood cannot build truth. The words were almost gentle, and for a moment, a listener might have thought mercy was coming. But then the executioner stepped forward, a broad man with arms like carved stone and a knife honed to a whisper-thin edge. The boy's eyes widened, his lips parted as if to speak, but the words never formed. Two guards took hold of him, their fingers digging into his shoulders. The the knife flashed, and in that brief arc of steel, the morning sun seemed to retreat. The sound was not loud, more a wet crack than a cry, but it cut through the courtyard more sharply than any trumpet. Blood spilled over the pale stone, running toward the shallow channels cut into the floor, channels designed long ago to carry away the mess of justice. The boy sagged against the guards, breath heaving, his face pale and clammy. One hand lay on the ground beside him, no longer part of him, its fingers still curled as if clinging to the truth it could not hold. The crowd did not gasp, they did not move. This was the shape of order in the empire, swift, unflinching, unsoftened by pity. Somewhere in the throng, a mother pressed her son closer, whispering words the boy could not hear. Perhaps they were words of warning, perhaps they were a vow. Darius turned away without haste, his robes whispering across the stone. The priest gathered his things, the guards reset their stance, and the life of Persepolis flowed on as though nothing had been severed. But in the far corner of the courtyard, the executioner bent to wash his blade in a bronze basin. As he did, he glanced once toward the palace steps, and the faintest shadow of doubt crossed his face, as if even he wondered whether the boy's words had been false, or whether the empire had simply needed them to be. And in that doubt, invisible to the crowd, but sharp as the knife's edge, a crack began to form, one that would, in time, spread through the marble heart of the empire itself. The day they came for Sisamnes. The sky above Susa was the color of dull bronze, heavy with heat and dust. The market had gone silent long before the guards reached the magistrate's house. They marched without the usual clatter of armor, each step measured, almost ceremonial, as if they were walking toward a shrine instead of a man's door. Inside, Sisamnes sat at a carved cedar table, fingers pressed into his temples, staring at a ledger left open before him. His eyes flicked to the doorway when the first shadow fell across it. He knew. No one had spoken a word yet, but he knew. The commander entered first, his face set in that rigid mask soldiers wore when the task before them was personal. Two more guards followed, gripping the magistrate by his arms before he could rise. His chair scraped harshly across the tiled floor, the sound like a blade being drawn. They led him into the street. The air outside was hot enough to burn the lungs. But still, the crowd gathered. Faces leaned out from doorways, shadows dark against the clay walls. No one spoke. Only the sound of the magistrate's sandals dragging on the stone echoed between the buildings. By the time they reached the central square, the platform had been prepared. A tall wooden frame stood against the palace wall, draped with a heavy sheet of coarse linen. Buckets of water, basins, and knives lay in neat, terrible order. The smell of oil and iron filled the air. Sisamnes was forced to his knees. His gaze darted upward to the palace balcony where Darius stood, hands resting on the rail. The king's eyes did not meet his. They stayed fixed somewhere above, as if the act about to unfold was beneath the dignity of his gaze. The executioner stepped forward. He was a broad man with the kind of shoulders built by years of lifting stones and bodies alike. His hands were clean, the nails trimmed, the fingers steady. He touched the magistrate's jaw, tilting his head as if assessing a cut of meat. Sisamnes flinched at the touch, a quick, involuntary jerk. When the first blade kissed his skin, it was not a stab, but a slow drawing of steel, the edge barely whispering against him. A bead of blood welled, then another, and then the air seemed to fill with the scent of copper. The executioner worked methodically, peeling the first strip from shoulder to elbow. The crowd did not move. Sisamnes' breath came in sharp bursts. He tried to speak once, but his voice cracked into nothing, the sound dissolving into the hot air. His eyes fixed on something far away, perhaps the edge of the sky. Perhaps a place in memory anywhere, but the hands that undressed him in such cruel precision. The executioner laid each strip of skin on the linen sheet. They glistened in the sunlight, twitching faintly as if reluctant to surrender to death. Every so often, he dipped his hands in the water basin, swirling them until the crimson cloud thinned. The sound of water slapping against the copper sides was loud in the hush. At one point, a gust of wind carried the scent across the square, a mingling of blood, sweat, and that sweet, almost cloying odor of raw flesh under the sun. Somewhere in the crowd, a child whimpered, the sound quickly muffled by a mother's hand. Time lost its shape. Minutes stretched into something heavier. By the time the last strip was taken, the magistrate was more shadow than man, his body trembling in small, uneven shivers. His head sagged forward, and for a moment it seemed he might slip away entirely, but the executioner did not allow that mercy until the work was done. When Sisamnes finally collapsed, they did not cover him. Instead, the executioner knelt beside the body and began to stitch the pieces of skin together, each pull of the needle accompanied by the rasp of thread against flesh. The linen sheet became a second skin, shaped into the seat cover that would adorn the judge's chair. The king descended the balcony steps then, moving with the same deliberate pace as when he had arrived. He did not look at the body. His gaze went instead to the chair the one his new magistrate, the son of Sisamnes, would sit upon from this day forward. The boy stood nearby, pale as parchment, his hands clenched so tightly the knuckles showed white. He did not cry, he did not look away, and when the king's eyes met his, there was no anger there, only a command carved deeper than any spoken order: remember. The guards lifted the chair and carried it into the hall of judgment. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving only the dark stain on the stones and the sound of flies beginning their slow, circling dance. By nightfall, the square was empty, but from the shadows beneath the colonnade, an old man watched the dark shape of the chair through the hall's open doors. He watched, and he listened, and he swore he could still hear the faint sound of linen creaking under a weight that was not yet there. The marketplace was loud that morning, the clatter of clay jars, the call of merchants, the bleating of goats being pulled toward slaughter. But the sound died as the guards came into view, 4 of them, in iron caps and scaled armor, cutting through the crowd like the prow of a warship. Behind them, stumbling to keep his balance, came a man with a sack tied over his head and his hands bound in front of him. His bare feet slapped against the dust-hardened street, leaving faint prints that filled quickly with grit. When they reached the central square, the sack was yanked away. The man blinked against the sudden light. His eyes were red-rimmed, his lips split and dry. He was not old, yet there was a weariness in him, as though he had carried years of guilt on his shoulders. The crowd pressed in, forming a ring of shadow and breathless silence. A herald read the charge theft from the royal granaries and the punishment. The man's gaze darted from the herald to the executioner, waiting nearby. The executioner's knife was short, the edge polished to a pale gleam. He did not hold it like a weapon, but like a tool, something to be used with care. The condemned man's breathing quickened. He flexed his fingers once, perhaps in an unconscious farewell to them. The guards forced him to his knees, pinning his arms to the block of cedar that stood dark and stained from years of similar duties. The first cut was swift, but the sound it made was not the clean slice of steel on meat. It was a layered noise, a sharp crack as bone yielded, the wet rip of muscle, and the hiss of breath torn from the man's lungs. The severed hand fell onto the wood and rolled, fingers still twitching in a grotesque echo of life. Blood streamed over the cedar and dripped into the grooves carved there to channel it away. The executioner stepped back, wiping his blade with a cloth that was already half scarlet. The man's face twisted, not just from the agony, but from the knowledge that the missing hand would follow him through every street, every marketplace, every whispered conversation until he died. But the punishment did not always end with the loss of a hand. There was a boy once barely into manhood accused of carrying false words from one village to another. They did not take his tongue, they took his ears. It happened at dusk, the air heavy with the smell of cooking fires. The boy was brought to the same square, his eyes darting toward every face he recognized in the crowd. His mother was there, clutching her shawl so tightly the veins stood out in her hands. The executioner did not speak to him. He simply stepped behind, seized the boy's head, and drew the blade in a clean, practiced motion. Blood coursed warm and fast down the boy's neck, soaking the collar of his tunic. The ears were dropped into a clay bowl held by a guard. The crowd murmured not in sympathy, but in a low ripple of satisfaction, as though the removal of those small pieces of flesh had somehow restored balance to the air. Others fared worse. There was a man who had crossed the boundary of land sacred to the fire temple. They took his feet, one at a time, as the chanting of priests mingled with his screams. He lay afterward on the temple steps, staring at the space where his legs ended, dust rising in tiny clouds with each shallow breath. In the empire, such wounds became permanent sentences. They spoke louder than words. A man without a hand was a thief, no matter what story he told. A man without ears had trafficked in lies. A man without feet had trespassed against the holy. No tribunal needed to remember their crimes. Their bodies remembered for them. In the evenings, when the heat of the day sank into the stones, those maimed by the law would move slowly through the streets. The children stared, the elders turned away. Yet the law's shadow clung to them as tangibly as the smell of dust and sweat in their clothes. Sometimes, in the torchlit corridors of the palace, Darius himself would pass by one of these marked men or women. His eyes would rest on them for a heartbeat, unreadable, before moving on. And those who met his gaze felt the same cold truth: the punishment was never just the blade. It was the life that came after. Somewhere in that truth was a deeper terror that the law did not merely correct a wrong. It reshaped a person into a living warning, one the city could read without a single word being spoken. And yet, in the silent moments after such judgments, there were always whispers, questions. Had the hand taken today truly stolen what it was accused of? Had the ears severed truly listened to lies? Or had the empire, vast and unchallenged, simply decided they had? The riverbank was quiet, save for the steady lap of water against the reeds. A thin mist clung to the surface, curling upward in pale ribbons that caught the early light. In the center of the bank, two great wooden hulls sat side by side, their prows pointing in opposite directions, lashed together with thick ropes. They were not fishing boats. Their decks bore no nets, no oars, only the dark iron rings fixed into the timbers, waiting. The prisoner was brought forward between two guards. His head hung low, his hair matted from the damp cell where he had been kept for 3 days without the mercy of water. His bare chest rose and fell with shallow, uneven breaths. The smell of him, sweat, old blood, and the stale sourness of fear mixed with the river's cool scent. The executioners worked without speaking. They laid him between the hulls, binding his legs and arms until only his head, hands, and feet protruded beyond the wood. Each knot was drawn tight enough to press bone against rope. His fingers twitched involuntarily, as if they might claw their way free, but the fibers held fast. Then came the bowls. One held milk thick with cream, the other honey glistening in the light. The first was forced between his lips until his stomach swelled painfully. The second was painted onto his skin, his face, his arms, the soles of his feet in slow, deliberate strokes. The honey caught in the creases of his eyelids, tugging at his lashes. Flies arrived first, the low hum of their wings growing louder as the sweetness carried across the bank. Then came the ants from the grass, and the wasps, their slender bodies slicing the air. A beetle crawled over his cheek, its tiny feet dragging across the dried salt of his skin. He turned his head to shake it off, but the motion only pressed his temple harder into the wood. The sun climbed higher, the milk in his belly curdled, churning into a sickness that made him gag. He tried to twist away from the nausea, but the boats held him immobile. His voice broke into a hoarse cry, swallowed quickly by the endless drone of insects. Days bled into one another. His face swelled where stings had found him, and the honey turned black with trapped flies. At night, the river cooled, and the damp seeped into his bones. His eyes would close for moments at a time, only to snap open at the sharp pinch of mandibles at his fingertips, or the slow, wet movement of maggots beneath his skin. Somewhere beyond the trees, the city continued its rhythms, traders calling out wares, sandals shuffling over stone, the temple bells marking the hours. Here, time was measured differently. It was measured in each bite, each pulse of pain, each breath that came slower than the last. Not all punishments needed the river. In the city's depths, another man faced a different kind of suffocation. They took him to a chamber beneath the temple, its walls sealed with clay, the air already heavy when the door was closed. In the center, a mound of pale ash lay waiting. It was fine as dust, the kind that clung to skin and throat. He was forced to kneel. A paddle stirred the ash into the air, turning the room into a swirling haze. It coated his lips, clung to his lashes, filled the hollow of his mouth until he coughed, the sound raw and desperate with every breath. The ash settled deeper into him. His chest rose sharply, then fell with a rattling sound. The guards stood outside, their silhouettes faint behind the door's narrow slit. One stirred the ash again. ensuring no pocket of clean air remained. Inside, the man's movements slowed, his knees shifted against the floor, his fingers curled into the powder. The gray film spread over his skin until even his tears turned the same dull color. By the time the door was opened, the mound had shifted only slightly. The body lay half buried, the chest still, the face tilted upward as if searching for the light that had never been there. Back at the river, the boats drifted slightly with the current, the ropes creaking as they strained against the bank. The prisoner still breathed, though each inhale was shallow and wet. His eyes, once sharp with defiance, had dulled to a glassy reflection of the sky above. Flies rose and settled, in a rhythm older than empires. And in both places, the silent chamber and the riverbank, the message was the same. The empire's justice did not need the speed of a sword. It could take its time, letting the punishment linger long enough for the body to remember, and for those who witnessed it to carry the memory deeper than any law carved in stone. The courtyard smelled of rain on hot stone, a sharp metallic scent that clung to the air long after the clouds had passed. Guards lined the walls in rigid formation, their bronze spearheads catching the last light of afternoon. In the center stood a man on his knees, his ankles bound, his hands tied behind his back with a cord so tight the skin had begun to purple. His name was not spoken. It did not matter now. Before him, a brazier hissed softly, its coals glowing the deep orange of a dying sun. Above the heat, a small crucible hung from an iron hook, its contents already beginning to simmer. The smell that rose from it was strange, not the scent of food, but of something far heavier, almost sweet in its way, like the breath before a storm. The crowd kept its distance. Even here, where executions were common, there was something different in the stillness. Whispers passed between a few of the older men, the kind of words carried only by those who remembered other nights, other punishments, and understood what molten metal could do to a body. The executioner was deliberate. He reached into the crucible with a long-handled ladle, lifting the metal silver, or perhaps gold, which shimmered like liquid sunlight. It rolled thick and slow in the bowl, catching the flicker of the fire in its surface. The prisoner's head was forced back, his jaw clenched, but the hands gripping him were too strong, the cord too tight. The first drop fell into his ear. His whole body convulsed, a sound like a muffled scream breaking from his throat. The smell changed instantly now, a sickening blend of scorched hair and the faint, nauseating scent of cooked marrow. Another drop followed, and another, each one sending a ripple through him that the cords absorbed without mercy. When it was done, he sagged forward, smoke curling faintly from his skin. The brazier hissed again as the executioner poured the last of the molten metal into the coals, extinguishing the glow with a sharp, angry spit. But there were punishments that did not rely on heat, only on the strength of the earth itself. In the gardens behind the Hall of Judgment, two young trees stood bent toward each other, their trunks drawn down and lashed together with thick ropes. The leaves trembled in the wind, but the tension in the wood was a living thing, humming faintly as if the trees were holding their breath. The condemned man was brought forward, his bare feet sinking slightly into the damp soil. His eyes darted to the trees, then to the ropes, then back again. He began to shake his head, muttering something that could have been a prayer or a bargain, but the guards moved without hesitation. His arms were tied to one trunk, his legs to the other. The ropes bit into his skin, the fibers grinding against bone. A signal was given. The knot holding the trees together was cut. The sound came first, a violent snap, as the trunks surged upward, their stored strength released in a single heartbeat. The man's body tore apart in the middle, a flash of red and white against the dark green of the leaves. For an instant, there was silence, as if even the air recoiled. Then the two halves fell to the ground, twitching, staining the soil. The trees stood straight again, their branches swaying gently as though nothing had happened. The ropes lay slack at their roots, still warm from the tension they had held. Night fell quickly after. The garden smelled of crushed leaves and the iron tang of blood. A few guards remained to keep watch, though there was nothing left to guard. One of them knelt and touched the damp earth where the man's heart had struck. His fingers came away dark. He wiped them on the grass, but the stain clung stubbornly to his skin. Far away, in the quiet chambers of the palace, the king sat in the dim light of an oil lamp. No sounds reached him from the courtyard, no whispers from the garden. Yet he seemed to hear them all the same, the hiss of molten metal, the snap of bending trees, as if the empire itself was reminding him of what was required to keep it whole. Outside, the wind moved through the branches. It carried the faintest echo of a scream that no longer had a source, only a memory, one that the garden would hold for as long as the trees stood. The execution ground was already crowded when the first light of day spilled over the palace walls. The air was heavy with the mingled smells of sweat, dust, and the faint metallic tang of dried blood from the day before. It was the kind of scent that lingered in the throat long after you left, clinging to memory as much as to skin. A line of prisoners stood in chains, their shadows stretching long and thin across the packed earth. Some swayed on their feet, their eyes downcast, others stared ahead, faces set like stone, refusing to give the onlookers the satisfaction of fear. Behind them, the guards shifted restlessly, the dull clink of armor breaking the silence. At the center of the square, a single figure knelt. He was richly dressed, though the fine fabric of his robe was torn at the shoulder where the guards had dragged him from his chambers. A thin gold torque still circled his neck, a symbol of his rank that no one had bothered to remove. His hair was matted against his brow, his mouth set in a grim line. This was no common thief or vagrant. He had once stood in the king's council. Now he was here to be unmade. The herald's voice rose above the low murmur of the crowd, naming his crimes, treachery, conspiracy, and the unspeakable act of plotting against the royal house. The words fell heavy into the morning air, each syllable like the tolling of a bell. The man did not flinch, but a muscle worked in his jaw, and his hands, bound behind his back, tightened into fists. The punishment would be public, as all such sentences were. It would be slow. It would leave nothing of his dignity intact. They led him to the gates of the city, where a wooden frame had been erected. From its beams hung iron chains, their ends fixed to shackles lying open on the ground. The guards forced him to his knees once more, clamping the cuffs around his wrists and ankles. The iron bit into his skin, cold despite the morning heat. The gates were opened, and the people streamed past merchants on their way to the market, children tugging at their mothers' hands, soldiers returning from the watchtowers. All of them were forced to walk by the prisoner. Many spat, some threw handfuls of dirt. A boy in a tattered tunic hurled a rotten fig that burst wetly against the man's cheek. Hours passed, the sun climbed higher, and the stone beneath him began to radiate heat through his knees. His lips cracked, his head drooped forward, still. The guards offered no water. By midday, the taunts grew louder. A group of young men began to circle, jeering, hurling pebbles at his back. One struck the side of his head, drawing a thin line of blood down his temple. He blinked hard, trying to clear the sweat from his eyes. As the afternoon wore on, the shadows shifted, and the heat gave way to a biting wind that swept through the open gate. The man shivered violently, his robe offering little protection now that it was torn in half. His breathing grew shallow. Each time his head dipped, it stayed lower before he managed to lift it again. In the crowd, there were those who watched silently. A woman with her face half covered by a scarf, an old man leaning on a stick, his eyes fixed not on the prisoner's face, but on the shackles around his wrists. They said nothing, but their stillness carried its own weight. By evening, the prisoner's voice was gone. The last words he had spoken quiet, almost to himself, had been lost in the noise of the crowd. The guards began to dismantle the frame, unhooking the chains with deliberate slowness. The man's body slumped forward, too weak to resist. But the sentence did not end with his release from the frame. He was led back through the city, down into the lower quarters, to a courtyard lit by the dull glow of oil lamps. There, the king's personal guard awaited him. They laid him on the ground, face to the sky. The stars were just beginning to appear, faint pinpricks in the violet dusk. A blade flashed in the lamplight, in a single, precise movement. The executioner severed the tendons in both his ankles. The pain tore a gasp from him, but no cry followed, only the sound of his breath catching in his throat. The guards stepped back, leaving him on the cold stones. He would live, but he would never walk again, and in this city. That was a slower death than any sword could give. Somewhere above, a bell tolled the end of the day. In the silence that followed, the prisoner turned his head slightly, as if trying to see the gates from where he lay. He would never pass through them again. And yet, the city would remember. Every passerby who saw him crawling through the streets, every whisper that followed his name, would carry the weight of this night. The punishment was done, but its shadow would stretch over him and over those who had watched for as long as the empire endured. Night had settled over the palace, swallowing the courtyards and columns in a dense, black stillness. The torches along the outer wall hissed in the wind, their flames bowing and shuddering like they knew something was moving through the dark. Inside the Hall of Judgment, the air was cold enough to bite. The chair stood alone at the far end, its carved arms gleaming faintly in the lamplight. The leather stretched across its seat was not the brown of oxhide, nor the pale of goat. It was the color of something once living, tanned and shaped by hands that had cut it from a man who had sat in judgment here before. The new magistrate entered quietly. His steps echoed on the stone, each one slower than the last. He paused halfway to the chair, staring at it as though it might rise and greet him. The hall was silent except for the faint creak of leather as the night breeze pushed against the shutters. When he reached the seat, he did not sit. His fingers hovered above it, close enough to feel the cold trapped in its surface. In the stillness, it seemed to breathe the faintest stretch of fabric, the whisper of strained stitching. He drew his hand back as though burned. Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of the city, the muffled call of a guard changing post, the rattle of chains being drawn across a gate, but deeper still, beneath the wind and the stone. There was another sound, almost too faint to name a slow, leathery sigh that seemed to come from the chair itself. He turned toward the door, his shadow sliding long across the floor. But before he left, he glanced back one last time. The lamp behind the chair flickered for a heartbeat. The shape of the leather shifted, like a muscle moving under skin. The door closed, the hall was empty again, and yet, in that emptiness, the chair waited for the next voice to pass, sentence, for the next body to fall silent, holding in its stitched seams the memory of every judgment that had ever been passed, and the ones that had yet to come.